Salam and welcome back to Somali Dispatch, somalidispatch.com. My name is Abdi Goulet. Somalia is at least politically once again grappling with a rift between its federal president Farmajo and Prime Minister Roble. This latest rift could seriously affect the country's security as well as, or just as importantly, as the country's long-awaited elections. To discuss the implications of the latest crisis, we reached out to Abdi Aynte, a former federal minister of Somalia and a co-founder of the Heritage Institute. He talked to us from Mogadishu. Aynte, welcome back to Somali Dispatch. Thank you for your time and for joining us. If you can start us off with an assessment of Somalia's current political situation would be great.
Thank you for having me again. It's a real honor to join you again. I think that the current political situation can be characterized as one that is animated by very high and very intense tension between the president and the prime minister over a number of issues. And that tension is now animating the political space of this country. And essentially, that is now leading to a standstill on almost all progresses on issues of elections principally, but also on security and other issues. I mean, everything comes to a standstill when the two top leaders of the country are at each other's throat, fighting over a number of issues.
Right. So let's go into the issues first. As everyone knows, a former operative of NISA, may God give her peace, Ikran Tahlil was abducted and is missing. And later, the spy chief said, she was killed by Al-Shabaab. That's how this whole thing started. Give us a brief history of that, what that entails, because it seems we're moving away from that and into a different type of a rift. Give us a bit of a background on that case.
Thank you for putting the attention back onto that case, because this is about the story of one of our sisters, one of our daughters. She's the daughter of someone, a family, and her family is understandably grieving about the issue and are very pained about it. I think the disappearance of Ikran 2 months ago and the silence on the part of the government really raised a lot of questions when the government eventually announced that she was abducted by Al-Shabaab and later killed by Al-Shabaab. I think that did not put the issue to rest. Quite the contrary. In fact, it raised more questions about the way she disappeared and what happened in the 2 months when she was missing from her family. So I do think that I think most people in Somalia now, including her family, but also most people I've seen speak about this issue, are calling for a credible, independent investigation into exactly the disappearance of Ikran Tahlil. I think she definitely deserves justice. Her family deserves justice, but also importantly to ensure that something like this does not happen very easily in the future. So I think that is the gist of the case. But really, this case now became a lightning rod in so many ways and sparked, I think, the political stalemate that you see now at the top level.
Right. It's clear from, at least from the prime minister's side of things, he wants just what you just stipulated, which is let's look into this. There are more questions than answers currently available. What does that questioning, that line of questioning or that interest mean for the president's side? Why so much hopla? Why so much deflection? If NISA released a statement saying this is what happened, they should be able to back it up. What does this mean for the president, let alone the former spy chief?
I mean, certainly this is now, the issue of Ikran now is very much weaved into the political competition that is happening in the country. And certainly there are figures, people who are at play here. I think the president certainly feels that this issue is being politicized, that he and his supporters believe that this issue is not a political issue, rather a tragic matter that happened in hands of al-Shabaab. But as we would all recall, al-Shabaab themselves even denied it and said that they were not behind the killing. Not that al-Shabaab are the most credible people, but they're usually very proud of killing government officials. So I think, the issue is now less about Ikran, more about the political competition and political tension that was already an underlying factor between the president and the prime minister. I think the Ikran case essentially helped brought that underlying tension into the fore, and that's what you see right now.
We've seen similar rifts before, presidents and prime ministers clashing, putting everything in danger that way, if you will. And that presidencies already have been set for the last 20 years. I believe there's like 12 prime ministers. What does this mean moving forward for if rifts like this continue in the country? What does it say about the stability of the country? Is Somalia rulable after this? Because if the two top leaders clash and everybody else gets involved, including the army, what does it mean for the country moving forward?
Well, I mean, there are a number of elements here. I think the first dimension to look into is the political dimension. Or I should say the constitutional dimension.
Right.
The constitution actually gives a substantial amount of powers to both the president and the prime minister. And keep in mind, the prime minister is not elected. The president is elected with, quote unquote, at least elected by 329 people in the parliament. And so there you have an inherent tension built into the system whereby the person who was elected actually has to essentially cede a lot of his power to a person who's not elected, who's appointed. So there you have an inherent tension built into the system. But then when you look at it from another dimension, we are a country that is emerging from about 3 decades of conflict, and we're still in a reconciliation phase. So the reason why we have a design of a prime minister and the president is to create, political accommodation for various communities in the country. And that accommodation comes with a lot of political power and capital. And so whether you are the prime minister or the president, you know that there is a political capital that you carry in the name of your clan. And so this is another dimension to look at it. I think the third and final dimension I would mention is just the fact that we have, we're coming from a nomadic culture. Not all Somalis, but the majority of Somalis are probably coming from a nomadic culture that is very egalitarian, that probably is very much, this macho culture where everyone wants to be powerful and overriding the other person. And so, we have very little culture in the way of, institutional checks and balances. The word checks and balance is really frowned upon in our political culture. No one wants to be checked or balanced for that matter. And so what you see here is a manifestation of really a resistance, a political culture that is resisting to the idea of checks and balance, because each one of them, the prime minister and the president, regardless of which clan they are from, at any given moment, would like to use enormous amount of power without the check and balance of the other. And so, you have institutions like the parliament, which is supposed to have an oversight role, but it barely does have an oversight role. And in fact, if you see the popular culture in our country, the few times when our parliament brought a motion of no confidence against sitting prime ministers or the cabinet, if you look at the discourse in our social media, it's really seen as an overreach on the part of the parliament, because we have, again, a culture that does not know a thing or two about oversight and about checks and balances.
And that description of the political reality on the ground, if you will, is beginning to take its toll, not just on Somalis. It's been taking toll on Somalis for the 3 decades you mentioned, but now it would seem it's actually crossing over and it's beginning to frustrate Somalia's partners, if you will, in trying to reestablish the governance there. We've heard President Museveni's frustrations over the last couple of days. Are we at a juncture where everyone is about to throw their hands in the air, so to speak? What ramification on that aspect does this ongoing rifts between the prime ministers and the presidents is going to have on dealings with the international community? AMSOM, for example, is a vital, to Somali government's existence in Mogadishu, at least. If they throw their hands up in the air, what does that mean?
Yeah, I mean, this is the million-dollar question, and the point that is now raised quite frequently here in Mogadishu and other places. People are drawing parallels with what happened in Afghanistan last month, and rightfully so. The context is fundamentally different, but some of the underlying factors are very much similar. When you have a political elite that is very much, fighting each other all the time, and fighting over power and resources, and not focused on what they were really sworn into, which is to protect the citizens of this country from Al-Shabaab and to provide basic services to the citizens, but who are failing consistently. I think the international community is really starting to rethink. In fact, I was part of conversations over the past few days with some of the key international partners on Somalia, who are saying that we should probably rethink about our approach to Somalia, because what it feels like is that we're spending enormous amount of money on AMISOM, but also supporting about more than 50% of the federal budget comes from international assistance. We're putting all of that money in, but all we see is you guys really fighting over things that really don't matter, and you do not seem to have the political maturity to settle your differences in a civil fashion, in a civil way. There are a number of ways. You certainly clearly do not have, a constitutional and legal way to settle these issues, because if you did, you would have settled them. So I do think that we are at a very critical juncture where these questions are being asked by our international partners, who are now beginning to question the relevance of their continued support and funding to Somalia, and the fact that if AMISOM were to withdraw today from Mogadishu, I think most analysts I have seen would say that it'll be a matter of days before Al-Shabaab takes over, or at least it would be a very bloody affair if that was to be the case. And that should not have been the case. I mean, AMISOM has been around for 14 years, and there were more than 100,000 troops that were trained over the past decade. In fact, I recently did a study on this issue, and I had followed the figures. And over $2 billion were spent on training and equipping our forces. Yet we're still struggling to exert control over large swathes of this country, and Al-Shabaab is doing it. In fact, the most recent conflict in Galmudug is very indicative of what could possibly happen. Al-Shabaab was pushed a few days, but they were able to push back pretty quickly after a few days, even with an air support from American drones. So I think we have to ask some critical questions to ourselves and really look ourselves in the mirror.
Much has been said about the army and propping up Somalia's political elites, if you will, or systems, be they the parliament or the cabinet, and there's been a lot of support from the international partners. But one thing that seems to be missing, if you will, and possibly could have been one of the solutions that could be found for such political rifts, is the judicial side of things. It doesn't seem as though parties that are involved are not paying a lot of attention to that. I think we need to build that up from the ground and upwards. And perhaps this constitutional rifts could be easily resolved by a higher court that's not appointed by every president that comes along. Just an editorial thought. What do you think of the judicial capacity of the country? It's pretty obvious that it's pretty much non-existent, and they just belong to one camp or the other. But is there a value in having that sort of a structure in place to move forward?
Look, again, I did another study recently, actually, that was published by the Heritage Institute on fixing the justice system. It was published earlier this year. It's a 30-page long study, which I was leading for a year, together with a number of researchers who've actually traveled to all the federal member states and have collected reams of data. In fact, I reviewed more than 1,000 pages of documents relating to our justice system. And the simple fact is that our justice system is broken, not only at the basic level, which is critical. In fact, one of the key, I think, parallels that Al-Shabaab draws very frequently is their judicial system as opposed to our judicial system. What they repeatedly show the citizens is that their judicial system is fair, fast, and enforceable. The three things that you need in any credible judicial system, where our judicial system is still, incredibly slow and not so fair for the most part, and in most cases not even enforceable. This is not to say that work has not been done on the judicial front. In fact, over the past decade, a lot has been achieved, and things are considerably better than they were 10 years ago, without a doubt. But I think we are far below where we needed to be. Now, in political terms, I think you're referring to the Constitutional Court, which is stipulated in our Constitution as one of the institutions that were supposed to be established, but was never done. And there are a number of reasons why it wasn't established. In fact, the procedure to establish the Constitutional Court itself is very complex, one that every president found very cumbersome. But the interesting thing is, I think one of the reasons why it wasn't established is because the Constitutional Court would immediately have it would be the platform or the court where you can litigate a motion of no confidence or impeachment against the president. And so no president would freely be willing to establish an institution that would essentially try him in a court of law. And that's why it wasn't established. And it says a lot about the state of mind that our political leaders are in when they're afraid to be held accountable. Now, what you have as opposed to that is appointed high court, which, as we've seen over the past decade or so, almost every president has dismissed the chief justice and the high court justices, without even rethinking about it, without a second thought. And so if they are serving at the pleasure of the president, which the cabinet members should be serving under the pleasure at the pleasure of the prime minister, then you can only imagine what they're able the cases they're able to litigate. So this is to say that, on the front of our justice system, it's as tragic of a story as any other aspect of our country. And unfortunately, a lot of us now are beginning to be very pessimistic on many fronts, although I think we should all be careful not to judge the entire country based on the events of the past few weeks. I think there are a lot of other good things that are happening in this country that ought to be celebrated.
Right, and one of those good things would have been the elections if done, on a timely and fair and free manner, which this rift is taking a toll on. What do you suppose? I know, there are parallels here with some states saying, we're going to forge ahead with holding finish the upper house elections. What sort of delay can be ascertained by this new rift is going to have on that process?
Well, without a doubt, I think the first adverse impact of this rift between the president and the prime minister is going to be on the elections, not only on the timetable of the elections, because remember, the prime minister is in fact in charge of the electoral processes. And this rift is partially, if not entirely, about the elections itself. You might see other dynamics playing out, but at the end of it, it is about the control and influence over the electoral processes. And so I think it's going to have an adverse impact on the timetable, but also potentially even on the actual elections itself, I mean, if the rift goes at the pace with which it's moving right now, there is a real potential that we may not even have elections anytime soon, or the whole thing might implode. I mean, God forbid, but that is a potential. I mean, remember what happened in February and April in Mogadishu? I mean, we're as fragile as it comes. And speaking of elections, look, every upper house, what happened in the upper house so far cannot be called elections. They were as sham of a rigged election as it comes. There was no competition. There were direct appointments. I think the president of Hirshabelle here needs to be applauded and celebrated for the list he was able to produce. About 32 people are competing for 8 seats. By all accounts, it's going to be very competitive process. And I think President Goodlawe has demonstrated that, you can hold free and fair elections if you have the will to do that. I think the rest of the presidents unfortunately have shown that they had more appetite to get their family and friends into high seats.
Yeah, it can't even be called a selection. It's even beyond that, according to some of the analysis done on that subject. There has been efforts and movements in regards to finding a solution to the current rift, as the Galmudug and Southwest state presidents are currently in Mogadishu and have apparently started meeting with the sides here. What do you foresee them accomplishing in this regard? Are they seen a good mediators politically in the eyes of both camps, specifically the prime ministers?
I think they are among other folks who are trying to mediate the situation. We should all wish them very well, because if the intention is to settle this matter, I think it's good for the country, it's good for all of us, and we should all wish them the best. I think there are also people who are not in a position who have good offices with both the president and the prime minister, and they are trying to do whatever they can to find a common ground on the situation. So far, it hasn't been going very well, but I think we can all remain optimistic and see if they're able to come up with a potential solution. If history, though, is any guide, this is not going to end very well. You've mentioned this at the top of the interview, that we've had 12 prime ministers, and there was a reason for that. And in fact, there was a specific episode in the past where during an election or close to an election, when you had a prime minister and a president, both of them are dead, Abdullah Yusuf and Nur Adde, Allah yarhamhum, had a similar episode, and I think we've seen where that ended. Usually, when you have a conflict of this magnitude, it is usually very difficult to recover from it. The best we can have right now is if the two guys simply agree on basically proceeding with the elections as planned, so we can just have elections and get over with all of this drama, hopefully in a few months' time.
I do agree, since the tenure of the government ran out, and elections is the only reason both of them actually exist in this political arena, is because we needed to have that election, and the 4-year term has come to an end and passed. Actually, I appreciate every time you join us in explaining some of these current situations in the country, and possibly talk to you in the future about those studies that you did that seem to be very targeted to areas that need further explanations to our audiences and to Somalis at large. I appreciate and thank you immensely for taking the time to explain this to us. Thank you.
Thank you for having me again. I really appreciate it.